Good morning. We are at the end of our second week of shutdown, and the president last night told us that we're in for a 2-week extension. So looks like we're going to have to continue with spending some time together over video, and I know I'm missing my Bible study group. So I decided to make a video so that we can have Bible study together anyway. So I hope you guys are all doing well. And if you remember rightly, we are in Luke chapter 20. So I hope you've got your Bibles in front of you. Just to give you a little bit of a reminder of where we've been, Jesus has just entered the town of Jerusalem. It is Holy Week. He has been to the temple and overturned all the tables and thrown out the moneylenders and accused the authorities of making the Lord's house of prayer into a den of robbers. And then it tells us that every day he was teaching in the temple. And in verse 47 of chapter 19, it says, the chief priests, the scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what he was saying. So again, Luke is highlighting for us the different responses that we have to the person of Jesus Christ. We either accept him or we reject him. And as we have repeatedly seen through this Gospel of Luke, and we see in the other Gospels, that it is the religious authorities that are rejecting Jesus, and it is the people, the everyday common people, who are accepting him. So that's where we finished last time we were all together. And so let's carry on with reading chapter 20. And we're going to read from verse 1 up to verse 20. So one day, as he was teaching the people in the temple and telling the good news, the chief priests and the scribes came with the elders and said to him, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Who is it who gave you this authority?" He answered them, "I will also ask you a question. You tell me, did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" They discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say it's from heaven, then he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us." For they were convinced that John was a prophet. So they answered that they did not know where it came from. Then Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." He began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to the tenants, and went to another country for a long time. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce from the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next he sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted and sent away empty-handed. Then he sent still a third. This one also they wounded and threw out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and they killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Heaven forbid." But he looked at them and said, "What then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the scribes and the chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, They wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people. So they watched him and sent spies and pretended to be honest in order to trap him by what he said, so as to hand him over to the jurisdiction and authority of the governor. So that's the bit we're going to look at this morning. So let's have a look. So we see Jesus teaching in the temple, telling the good news. Let's have a look at that, the good news. For most of us, we think the good news is the good news of Jesus' death and resurrection, which is true, that is good news. But what was Jesus himself preaching? The good news that Jesus preached was the presence of God's kingdom here on earth, that manifest reality of God's authority and rule, and that is made through the lives of those that believe in him. Wherever the king rules, that is his kingdom. And this is why it's so important for us as Christians to live as Christians, to live our lives according to the teachings of Jesus, and to really live out those teachings, because that is where God's presence is felt within the world. And you'll find those, if you want a big collection, in Matthew 5-7, and it's the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount. And right in there, Jesus says that we are to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. And we can only be that. We can only be the ones that produce an environment where there is growth and life and nurture and sustenance if we're actually living the life that we're called to. Because for many, many cases, if the world is left to itself, we know that humanity, all of us, are capable of really ugly, really nasty things, and treating the world and our environment and treating each other's badly, which is what makes it very important for Christians to really live out of a saved heart that has been transformed, that we really can be the light of the world and can be the salt and the manure as it was used for in those days. So that's the good news that Jesus was preaching, that God's kingdom, that his precepts, his way of living and being in a relationship with him can fundamentally change our experience of life. And of course, that is fulfilled on an even greater level through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and the transformed brand new heart we experience when we give our lives to him. So the chief priests and the scribes and the elders come up to Jesus and say to him, by what authority are you doing these things? These things meaning the clearing out of the temple and the teachings that he was given. You see, the temple, the running of the temple and its activities was under the authority and the control of the high priests. It was the central place of priestly worship. That's where they ran everything, and through people's necessity in coming to the temple through the festivals and things, it was the priests that ran, if you like, the country of Israel in terms of its worship. And they saw themselves as being divinely appointed by God. They descended from the line of Aaron. They were in charge of temple worship. And yet Jesus had walked straight into the middle of their domain, so to speak, and completely turned it on its head. He had overturned the money counters' tables. He had chased the livestock out, which was not just a cleaning spree, but really was a challenge, in-your-face challenge to the ruling authorities and the temple authorities. So they weren't asking, what authority are you doing this? It was more along the lines of, what on earth do you think you're doing? Kind of question. So Jesus looks at them and he asks them, well, by what authority did the baptism of John fall under? Was it from heaven or was it from human origin? And here we see Jesus engaging in another bit of quick thinking. He was smart, and his comments and his debates with the religious authorities are very interesting to see. And the authorities immediately recognize that they're stuck, because John the Baptist pointed to Jesus. So if they accept John the Baptist, they have to accept Jesus. But if they deny John the Baptist in order to deny Jesus, then they're going to get into trouble with people. And that's quite ironic, because these are the guys that are claiming divine authority, and yet they're backing down because they're afraid of what the people are going to say. Anyway, so they said they didn't know. So then we move on to the parable that Jesus told. And this is quite interesting, this parable. It is a parable about a guy who plants a vineyard, hands it over to other people to tend, and then when he comes to collect his share of the produce, the people reject him and reject his servants to the point where he has to send his son, whom they kill. And there are a couple of interesting layers to this parable. The first one is that this is a very real experience of the people of Israel at this point. They, starting with the Ptolemies, who were in charge under just after Alexander, when Alexander the Great died and carved up his kingdom, he put it in charge of his 4 generals, and they instituted a system whereby they took land from the people and gave it to their favorite generals, if you like, and they owned it. But they obviously weren't living in Israel. So they had tenant farmers that would then farm the land and send some of the produce back to the landowner. And they would keep the rest for themselves, which is not the way that God asked Israel to run its agriculture. But it was a situation that had been around for a century by that point. And it was something that Herod the Great then capitalized on, and he also took land away from people and gave it to his trusted leaders. So this was a situation that a lot of the people of Israel found themselves in at this time, was farming land that wasn't their own. But this is an honor and shame society where honoring your commitments was very important. And for a tenant farmer to behave in this way and to to chase away the representatives of the owner who had come to collect their share would have been shocking and downright unacceptable. So as the people would have heard this parable, and as we listen to this parable, we are drawn into following the story and being absolutely shocked and horrified at the way these tenant farmers are behaving. And when they kill the son of the owner of the vineyard, it is absolutely shocking. And we want to support the judgment that is coming to them. And we say, of course, these people need punishing. This is not the way to behave. But we see that when Jesus says, or he asks the listeners a question, he says, what then will the owner of the vineyard do? And then he answers it, and it's quite a harsh judgment. He says that he will destroy the tenants and he will give the vineyard to others. And then the verse, what verse is it? 16. They reply, heaven forbid, like this can't be. Why are they saying that? Because you'd think that they would support the people being judged. Do they think it's too harsh a judgment? Well, I think that heaven forbid can be interpreted a number of ways. One almost like, surely this cannot happen. Because as they were listening to this parable, this is not the first time we read of in Scripture of a vineyard where when it comes to harvest time, things don't go well. And I am fairly sure that this parable would have rung bells with the Israelite people because it would have reminded them of Isaiah chapter 5, which is known as the Song of the Vineyard. And please go and read that. Verses 1 to 7 are very important. Isaiah is singing a song about his beloved, or to God, who had a vineyard, and he talks about how he tended it, how he built a watchtower, and he made a wine press. And then when it came to the season where the fruit was on the vine, he went, and instead of finding good grapes, he finds only bad fruit. And God then speaks and says to the people of Judah, he says, you judge between me and my vineyard. Is there anything else I could have done? And he said, and he goes on to say, what am I going to do now? I'm going to destroy my vineyard. And he interprets, he gives us an interpretation in verse 7. He says, the vineyard of the Lord Almighty is the nation of Israel and the people of Judah, and the vines he delights in. So what he's saying is that the vineyard that he tended is actually the nation of Israel. And he came to the people of Israel expecting to find a people that had followed his teachings, to find justice, to find righteousness, to find a holy people. But instead, he says, he found only bloodshed, and he heard cries of distress. So I'm sure this was ringing in the ears of the people as he tells this parable. So when they say heaven forbid, it's like, this can't be, because Isaiah wrote this in the decade round about 730 years before the birth of Christ. And it was about 150 years later that this judgment came to pass, and Judah was carried off by Babylonians, and quite literally they were destroyed. The temple was destroyed, the people were destroyed, they were taken off into captivity. So this piece of poetry from Isaiah is very much a judgment against God's people for the way that they behaved in the past. So Jesus is telling this parable, and this must be echoing in their heads, so that heaven forbid, can this be happening again kind of thing. But there's an added twist in this, because at the end of this, Jesus says that they actually killed the son. They killed the son in Jesus's parable. So he's intimating that he's saying flat out, you are rejecting the son, which is him. And when they said, surely we're not rejecting, the Lord's son, he turns around and he says to them, so then in that case, what does this text mean? And he quotes then from Psalm 118, and he says, the stone that the builders have rejected has become the cornerstone. Now, if we read on in the book of Acts, Peter clearly uses this verse, he quotes it to say that, and Jesus is the cornerstone that you builders have rejected, talking to the people of Israel. So this parable is a very firm judgment against the people of Israel, particularly the leaders and those in authority. Because if we continue to read, it says, Jesus then says, everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone who falls on it. When the scribes and the Pharisees realized that he told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people. So the leaders that were there challenging him saw this very much as being pointed at them, and saw that this parable was a judgment against them. And that verse 18, where Jesus says, everyone who falls on this stone will be broken. Yeah, how we choose to respond to Jesus is either going to result in grace and forgiveness, or it's going to respond in judgment, almost a self-imposed judgment, because we are the ones making the decision to reject Jesus. So it's very important that we consider well a case for faith in Jesus Christ, because there are going to be consequences. The very last verse that we've just read, verse 19, the end of it says that they wanted to lay on hands at him. Yeah. And I'm just reminded that there is a good reason why we update Bible translations, because to lay on hands on someone in today's religious context tends to mean to pray for them, but that's not what these guys had in mind, clearly. But again, we hear that their desire for violence against Jesus is being almost held back because they are afraid of people and what the people are going to say, which mirrors the verses we looked at right at the beginning in chapter 19, verse 47 and 48, that these leaders, what they feel about Jesus is completely opposite to what people feel about Jesus. But to finish off, they are watching and sending spies who pretend to be honest in order to trap Jesus by what he said, so that they can hand him over to the jurisdiction and the authority of the governor. So even here at the beginning of Holy Week, we see their plan to hand Jesus over to the secular authorities and the Roman representatives in order for them to get rid of Jesus. And it's just shocking to see how they send spies who pretend to be honest. That these are the gatekeepers to the people of Israel. These are the spiritual leaders who are plotting to kill someone who doesn't agree with them, and how they're prepared to lie and scheme to get what they want. It's a shocking indictment on leadership. And yet we see so much of that sort of thing going on within governments, and sadly even within the church. But I'd like to end by just asking this sort of comment on this passage, is how are we responding to Jesus and the teachings of Jesus? Are we like the people, eager to hear more of what Jesus has to say and accepting of his teachings? Or do we find them difficult and uncomfortable, and do we seek to reject Jesus, and even to the point of becoming hostile towards him? I think if you're watching this video, most of us are relatively open to Jesus, all the way through to being passionate about Jesus. But do we accept everything that he says, or do we tend to push aside some of his teachings and say, well, I'm not happy with that one? Do we reject? Because in honesty, if we're going to be honest, you cannot accept only part of Jesus and reject another aspect of him. And I think we need to wrestle with those bits that we struggle with, so that we can have a coherent faith, one where God has every part of our heart and our mind. So I would just like to encourage you to think about that. Think about, how am I responding to the whole teachings of Jesus Christ? I hope you've had fun today. I'm going to carry on and do a little bit more Bible study over the next few days, and I'll put it up there so that we can continue to dig into God's word, even though we're not allowed to do it together. So have fun, and thanks for joining me today. Bye.